Good evening. We are now going to start the very final session of our conference. We are glad to have Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed Choudhury, PhD, who is a former foreign advisor, caretaker government of Bangladesh, and we also, he will be chairing the session. We are also glad to have Mr. Clinton Poke, Deputy High Commissioner, Australian High Commission, Bangladesh, as the guest of honor. I'll make a short presentation. Then we have four distinguished panelists: Dr. Fahmida Khatun, Executive Director of Center for Policy Dialogue; Dr. Lalefur Yasmin, Professor, Department of International Relations, University of Dhaka; AKM Fahim Masroor, he's on the way and he'll be joining very shortly. He's the co-founder and CEO of BD Jobs. And also we have Mr. Parvez Karim Abbasi, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, East West University. So I now request Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed Choudhury to make the initial deliberation, and then we'll also request after that our guest of honor to make the initial comment. So over to you, sir. Please. So as instructed by our chair, I can now request Clinton Poke, Deputy High Commissioner, Australian High Commission, to make his initial comments, please.
Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. Ambassador, Dr. Salim, Dr. Fahmida, I think to be joined later by AKM Fahim Masroor, Dr. Lalefur, and Dr. Parvez, as well as all distinguished guests. My name is Clinton Popke. I'm the Deputy High Commissioner at the Australian High Commission in Bangladesh. So to start with, on behalf of the Australian government, I'd like to congratulate SAEC for hosting its 8th annual conference, annual Economist Conference. And I would also like to thank in particular Dr. Salim Rehan and Dr. Lalefur Yasmin and Dr. Fahmida Khatun, in particular for all their work and their support to our High Commission. I know that there's a very close working relationship with our teams. And Dr. Fahmida actually chaired another panel with the Australian Climate Change Ambassador last week, so they've been seeing quite a lot of us. Also very pleased to sponsor the 8th SAEC Economist Conference. I'm an economist myself, so economist at heart. I started my career in Australia at a think tank called the Productivity Commission. These days, unfortunately, I find myself commissioning all the fun, interesting economic work out to others rather than getting a chance to do it myself. But it's still really great to be a part of an economic conversation. So, very pleased to be here as a special guest. I was reluctant to be presented here tonight as a panelist. My view is that questions of Bangladesh economic resilience are for Bangladeshis to ask and for Bangladeshis to answer. So that's one reason. The other reason is I'm very obviously intellectually outgunned by all of the other panel members that will be going on stage tonight, and so very happy to leave the deeper conversation to them. But I did want to touch upon three main areas tonight. One, emphasizing that economic resilience is a common challenge in a globally interconnected world. Two, talk a little bit about Australia's own approach to economic resilience. And then finally, how Australia and Bangladesh can work together to bolster economic resilience. So the first point, economic policy and foreign policy have always been interlinked, but now they're at the point where it's almost indistinguishable. And this is in large part a result of all of our biggest challenges being global in nature, which makes developing economic resilience a shared project. So some of the shocks we've seen over the last 20 years, global financial crisis, a global health pandemic, energy and inflation spike that followed COVID but exacerbated by war in Ukraine and now the Middle East, and of course throughout the whole period the economic impacts of global warming. So to varying extents, countries have tried to coordinate their response to such shocks, or even construct mechanisms to coordinate their response. Yeah, with varying degrees of success. But perhaps the G20 response to the global financial crisis is the closest thing to a success we've had there. My second point, I guess, is that this economic dependence, as we now know it, is increasingly viewed as both an opportunity and a vulnerability. So trade and investment are being fragmented by geostrategic competition, concerns around supply chain risks, coercive uses of trade, and uses of trade measures to apply political pressure in other areas, which is putting pressure on global trade norms and global trade rules that have been operating in the post-World War II environment. So, in short, both Australia and Bangladesh must grapple in a world where trade is a vulnerability and an opportunity. Which then takes me, I guess, to Australia's own approach in this sphere. Like Bangladesh, we are fundamentally a trading nation. And the importance of openness and rules to our economic security is underpinned by the role that trade plays in our economy. Trade and foreign direct investment has been an integral part of Australia's own sort of economic journey since Federation. Currently today, 1 in 4 Australian jobs are related to trade. Around 30% of Australia's economic output is supported by trade. In large part, our commitment to openness of our own markets and the flexibility of our markets is the kind of the primary defense or the primary way we have of managing the economic shocks we're talking about, including shocks caused by changes in other countries' trade policies. So given this, it's quite unsurprising that Australia is a strong supporter of an open, rules-based trade and investment system, a system that has underpinned historic gains in global security and prosperity, and most notably for the past 35 years across the Indo-Pacific. So WTO rules enforceable through the WTO dispute system, in Australia's case, as a practical example, helped secure the reopening of Australian wine and barley trade into China earlier last year. A lot of things happened to secure that outcome, but the existence of that mechanism and Australia's engagement with that mechanism was integral to achieving that outcome. And likewise, actually, Bangladesh has been a successful user of the WTO system. In 2004, it became the first or least developed country to use the WTO dispute settlement system as a principal party. So then, looking at what Australia does domestically to address economic resilience and that kind of coordinated, multi-agency, multifaceted effort, we do this through a number of ways. One is more kind of proactive efforts to diversify and de-risk trade, while still maintaining openness and avoiding fragmentation. We also are looking closely at how to address supply chain disruption, while continuing to promote innovation and diversity and to markets. Now, part of what does that mean to address a supply chain disruption? And this is very much thinking that's come to the fore in the sort of post-COVID era, when we actually for the first time felt exposed, as many in the whole world did, by this kind of breakdown of global shipping and shortages of key materials. And part of this work is really analytical, so it's understanding the risks and vulnerabilities that your economy has to such disruptions. And you know, the work this was addressed in Australia through my old organisation, long after I left, the Productivity Commission in 2021, had a commissioned study report on critical supply chain vulnerability, and in that same year, Australia established the Office of Supply Chain Resilience. So again, it's an office that can undertake kind of analytical work, but can also provide policy advice to government about what the vulnerabilities are and how they can be addressed. As I said earlier, that work in diversifying and de-risking trade, which I'll come back to. Likewise, actually, in Australia over the last 15 years, a lot of work rethinking our approach to foreign direct investment. Again, foreign direct investment has always driven Australian growth, but I think there has been a much more deeper and holistic think about it that acknowledges some of the risks that come from foreign direct investment. So we want to maintain the sort of the character of openness that Australia relies upon. So within our FDI system, we have what we call a negative test. So the presumption is that an FDI proposal will proceed unless it's found to be contrary to the national interest. But then, to make that determination, you have to have a clearly articulated approach to the assessment. And so defining how you see your own national interest, how you incorporate environmental concerns or community concerns even around investment and how that impacts on Australia. And then, of course, the host of other kind of areas that all countries are grappling with around cybersecurity, which has long been an issue, but now has accelerated due to the introduction of artificial intelligence in ways that I don't think we have properly come to terms with. And likewise, managing the demands of climate change while supporting energy security and the needs of Australia's own population, but as well as our trading partners, including Bangladesh. So then that takes me to the third and final part, is looking at how Australia can work with Bangladesh on economic resilience. And part of that is around that trade diversification story. Both Australia and Bangladesh can improve economic resilience by diversifying our trade partners, and we can do it by increasing trade with each other. And this is already happening. We sort of organically have got extremely fast trade ties growing with Bangladesh, more than 10%, 12% a year, growing in trade, two-way trade, and roughly equal, as it turns out as well, in terms of imports and exports. So then we've got this organic growth, but that's not enough. So that's where there's a kind of a role for government or trade promotion or agencies to kind of step in and be a little bit more proactive. And so we're really happy to say that our own trade promotion agency, Austrade, is stepping up the tempo of its private sector engagement. And for the first time here in Bangladesh, we have an Austrade resident commissioner based here, which is a significant step for us and one that we hope will yield dividends. The other area of support on my mind is opportunities for Australia to assist in the development of economic policies and institutions in Bangladesh that will support economic resilience. And obviously there's a ton of thinking and work going on in this space by the interim government and lots of others also trying to enter and be as helpful as possible. And so you sort of got a sense of perhaps a window of opportunity and a little bit of a window of reform momentum. But likewise, I'm very conscious of Bangladesh's journey towards LDC graduation. And so then what could Australia usefully help with Bangladesh as it goes on that journey? And the big one there is obviously around duty-free, quota-free access to the Australian market. So Bangladesh has unfettered access, no tariffs, no quotas, and we've made a commitment that will continue after LDC graduation. So the upside of that is probably Bangladesh won't immediately need a free trade agreement with Australia post LDC graduation, but it will need these with a whole range of other countries. And so there again, we're quite happy to report our Australia Awards program next month. Actually, around 20 Bangladesh government officials are travelling to Australia to learn about Australian approaches to trade negotiation. And then as Bangladesh forms new trade agreements with its major partners, it is going to need to seriously look at its tariff settings, which in many areas are very, very high. But then, of course, you can't do that by itself. You need to do that while building up alternative sources to government revenues. And so you end up with quite a challenging need for a policy reformer across multiple areas. And here, we're one player of many, but again, we're pleased to support these kinds of policy deliberation through a program we have. It's one of my favourite acronyms. It's called the Bangladesh Economic Engagement Program, which you can shorten to BEEP. And that's about $8.5 million that we put through the World Bank and International Finance Corporation to support Bangladesh's economic reform priorities. And then lastly, I guess, is that kind of regional economic integration piece. And again, the development of transparent and consensual rules for the region is something that we support and will always support. Australia is party to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and we understand there's interest in Bangladesh in joining this, and so it's an area where potentially we can also offer our own support in whatever way would be valued by Bangladesh. So I think I'll pause there and pass the conversation over to the much bigger brains on the panel, but just finish by noting that Australia grapples with many of the same big picture questions as Bangladesh in terms of economic resilience. and we're keen to continue walking alongside Bangladesh to address them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clinton. Thank you. May I request now Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhary to make the initial deliberation.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I should be frightfully remiss were I to begin without thanking Sanim for this honor accorded me. It was lovely to hear our Australian colleague go before me. It's a country which is, for a variety of reasons, very dear to my heart. I began my career on the Australian desk, the Planning Commission at one stage when we had the SANS agreement and wheat purchase, etc., etc. Those days, the development cooperation component of foreign affairs was called IFAD, I think. ADAB. And so since the days of our inception, Bangladesh and Australia have always gone a waltzing Matilda together. So the other thing is, much of what I'm about to say to you, and thank you so much for being here in such numbers, is culled from my own experience in economic governance in Bangladesh, which began in the early 70s in the Planning Commission of Bangladesh. Thereafter, of course, I spent a period in various ministries at home. I was ambassador to the World Trade Organization and then a member of the cabinet of the caretaker government, but finally now as a student of global political economy. In the early days, the perception of Bangladesh in the global community oscillated from being viewed as a bottomless basket case on the one hand with unlimited needs and to the other, Bangladesh paradox, a proffered example of how growth and development could occur despite enormous constraints. The first 5-year plan in Bangladesh continued to be influenced by what was called the Haradoma model inherited from Pakistan. It was promoting rapid industrialization under ownership and control of the rising middle class with assistance from the donors. Bangladeshi planners, the Harvard School, etc., added rigor to the model by complementing it with a multi-sector input-output table and linear programming techniques. Strategic leadership accorded by the likes of Professors Nurul Islam, Rahman Subhan, Anisur Rahman, and Musharraf Hussain, combined with the technical administrative acumen of people such as Mr. Saiduzzaman, M. Saiduzzaman, and Dr. Sattar, yielded positive results. The system managed to impart a kinetic fillip to rapid growth and development along the matrix of public and private sectors. Several factors across a spectrum of years helped. These were, 1, effective utilization of foreign assistance. 2, a shift from agriculture to manufacturing as land space shrank to accommodate urbanization. 3, an unleashing of remarkable entrepreneurial spirit in the private sector as in the RMG and pharmaceuticals. And 4, a vibrant civil society intellectually aiding social transformation such as women empowerment. As to such soft power, when I was in Geneva, I used to hear it being said that parts of the world are marching to tunes first piped by Grameen and Brack in Bangladesh. However, as we evolve, particularly during the last decade and a half, as Devapriya Bhattacharya's and his team's brilliant white paper argued, powerfully argued, and they covered, as you know, the widest spread of issues, including corruption, inflation, growth, banking, expenditure, and inequality that impact every aspect of our life. The old model of creating some wealthy oligarchs with the hope that their riches would trickle down to the masses had failed due to improper governance. These oligarchs enrich themselves not by entrepreneurial efforts earning profits, but by predatory plunder of public resources. Rather than reinvest in the economy, they siphoned off abroad their ill-gotten resources. In the meanwhile, a milieu had been emerging whereby there was taking place a marriage of convenience between two philosophies from the political extremities of both the right and the left. In the Cold War decades and thereafter, the structural dependency theorists achieved some saliency. Many of these, like Hans Singer, Raul Prebisch, Osvaldo Sankel, and Celso Furtado, emanated from Latin America. There were also representatives from the so-called Third World, such as Samir Amin from North Africa and Mahbub al-Haq from Pakistan. To them, the former, and I'm explaining the structural dependency at school now, the former, they argued that the neo-imperialist system allowed for the continued exploitation of the periphery by the center, and by the center they meant the metropolitan powers. Either directly or through its partners who were the comprador elite in the south, in the developing countries. Hence, most economic interactions between the north and the south, according to this school, are implicitly exploitative and hence must be cut or altered through revolution. So this was the structural dependency school, which argued that an economic relationship with the developed parts of the world was exploitative, therefore negative, therefore must be cut or altered or changed through revolution. Or so it was against foreign assistance, foreign aid. Now, these Western and other neo-Marxists were eventually joined by the extreme right of the metropolis. I'm talking of today, present day. The hardcore Republican right in the US today see inefficacies in trying to influence the world to conform to certain values by offer of material benefits. To them, say, China's joining the WTO did not necessarily bring it into the global club, but instead made it a more powerful antagonist, now requiring decoupling or de-risking. President Trump and Elon Musk have criticized, indeed halted, supposedly value-influencing funding abroad. There is an accompanying rise of the right in Europe, once the epicenter of liberal values. As we watch the shifting politics of Ukraine between Europe, Russia, and the United States, and the burgeoning influence of the right in Europe, we wonder if the liberal attitude towards development cooperation would perennially sustain. In other words, what I am saying, and this is an incipient thesis which is waiting to be written, is that there is going to be eventually an understanding or agreement in principle between the right and the left in the global, across the global political spectrum, which would dry up external resources for developing countries. So that's the thesis. In this muddy global milieu, it is in this muddy global milieu that Bangladesh would need to navigate itself through its graduation out of the list of LDCs, list of the least developed countries. Now, this graduation could be both a boon and a bane. It is a boon because it implies an acknowledgement of progress, naturally, that would improve its image, Bangladesh's image, and would give it better credit ratings, allowing it to borrow more cheaply on the global market. It would be a bane because it would end the spatial privileges and preferences as under European Union's everything but arms initiative, and subject Bangladesh, that is, to greater scrutiny given the changing global scenario for GSP plus treatment. Bangladesh might find itself in a terrain where trade is a tug of war of tariffs, and the great wisdom in the club rules of commerce is that there are no friends in the marketplace. I myself, this is my own intellectual development, at one point in time would subscribe to the adage that preferences only tend to prolong pain, and I've said it elsewhere in seminars in Dhaka over the last few months. But I'm also aware that we are not absolutely ready for facing the real marketplace, graduating that is. Still, time is of the essence. Bangladesh does have a hill to climb, and waiting will not make it any smaller. But this is also time to draw some comfort and succor from what Professor Joseph Nye would have called our soft power. This is our non-technological wealth, Bangladesh's non-technological power deriving from our intellectual reservoir. This is the traditional pride of Bengal, as if it were, and you've heard it being said, or if you haven't, you will, that what Bengal thinks today, India thinks tomorrow, etc., etc. So Bengal usually sees itself, or it saw itself as a reservoir of intellectual power, largely perhaps also due to the fact that India, it was the first segment of the subcontinent to be exposed to British colonialism. Anyway, which is why Professor Muhammad Yunus's entry at the nation's steward at this time was very critical. His 2006 Nobel was on work towards creating economic and social work from below. To him, Adam Smith's theoretical framework of capitalism's invisible hands is skewed in favor of the favored. Dr. Yunus's belief that there is a flip side of humanity for each of us that can be creatively transformed into profit-making is amply attested in the success of his social business schemes. Yes, economic growth is the rising tide that lifts all boats and peoples in them. But what about those who cling on to leaky boats, or those who have no boats at all? The 2024 Nobel Prize-winning economists Simon Johnson, James Robinson, and Darren Acemoglu have affirmed that societies with poor rule of law and institutions that exploit their population do not generate change for the better. They squeeze resources from the wider population to benefit the elites. The panacea, therefore, is building inclusive socio-economic institutions in an environment of good governance. These realizations should allow Bangladesh 2.0 to make a good start. No sector of policy, economic or otherwise, should remain an elite preserve. All policies should be people-centric. Salus populi suprema lex. The interest of the people is the supreme law. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. So given the kind of time constraint, because a couple of my panelists, they requested to complete the session by 7:30 because they have other engagement. So what I'll do, I'll not go for big presentations. I'll actually make my presentation brief so that we get more time for our panelists and also little time for having some questions from the audience. So what I'll do, let me, I think we have got two excellent perspectives, one from Clinton about the kind of Australia's engagement in Bangladesh, and also from Professor Ambassador Iftikhar Ahmed Choudhury, while he actually talked about Bangladesh's origin and then the kind of development narrative, the challenges, and then he brought very interesting global dynamics. I think it was so, I would say that very rich discussion what we have heard so far. But let me focus very much on Bangladesh, because here I wanted to unpack Bangladesh's economic resilience. So just for the audience, I know many of them are students. What do you mean by economic resilience? If I just want to say it very briefly, that it shows that how much capacity a country has to absorb the shock, for any external shock or internal shock. So, and then how quickly the country can go back to the normal state or kind of, pre-shock period. So that is the kind of broadly economic resilience, but we can definitely debate on this definition, and we can have more nitty-gritty or more discussion on this. But there are concerns over Bangladesh's economic resilience because we need to understand this whole issue of economic resilience in the context of new national and global context. I'm very thankful to my two previous speakers. Very nicely they laid out the whole issues. But again, I think I would like to challenge that. That has been a narrative for long, that Bangladesh has a kind of stable, or the economy is resilient to any shock, and there is the kind of, it says that even the apparent political stability over the past 1.5 decades gave it a kind of resilience to the economic in the economic front. But I would say that it is not, because there was a lack of reform. I would say the three areas which really were big concerns: lack of reform, resistance to reform, poor quality of institution, which really came out very strongly in some of the discussion, and data manipulation, because many of the things which we now see, or we have heard about the progress, probably the data was not right. So we need to rethink, and we need to go beyond this common belief and have a critical understanding. So there are concerns, and I actually, I belong to that idea that our economy is not really resilient enough to absorb the internal external shocks. I give you one example. Take, for example, this inflationary trend. Here I'm comparing Bangladesh with India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. I could bring in other countries too, which would make this graph messier, but I just wanted to keep it simple. Here I have got this data from January 2022 and until September, October last year, and even you can update it until December last year or January. You see that compared to all countries, Bangladesh failed to contain inflation. So why I'm focusing on inflation as an example of fragility? Inflation is like fever. It is not the disease, or it is not the kind of any particular problem in your body. It's a symptom of any problem. So inflation shows that there is a serious problem in there, and inflation can happen, but inability to contain inflation for a long period of time, it shows that there are serious problems in the economy, and that shows the kind of fragility. So now if I come to the major components of economic resilience, I think it is very important to understand the structure of the economy, the pattern of structural transformation, status of macroeconomic stability, structure of trade, and I'm quite sure over the last 2 or 2.5 days, many of the participants, you have heard about the kind of problems in our external sector, in the trade, and even the session which was there at between 2 and 4 p.m. today, you also heard about serious problems of our external sector. Structure of social sector, especially poverty, employment, health, education, social protection, domestic political economy. In many of the discourse, and that's what I really like to make the point, that many of the discourse when it comes to economic resilience or economic security, the emphasis is more on the external shocks. But internal domestic political economy plays very important role in building that kind of resilience structure. So I think that is something very important. And then interplays with the geopolitics. So I have two very eminent political scientists, or they deal with the political economy issues here as the discussants. So they will talk about these issues. Probably I'll have a very small slide on that. Structure of the economy, I don't really want to get into it, but we have serious problems. We have, in the structure, in the GDP, we are seeing shift from agriculture to other sectors, but employment, it is not really happening. So there are serious dominance of the informal sector. So we need to, that doesn't really help us in building a resilient economy. We have been talking about this stagnant private sector investment for long, and today probably if you have seen Dr. Jahid Hossain's presentation, he showed that the kind of middle income trap where very stagnant private sector investment. But here I'm making a point comparing Bangladesh with countries in Southeast Asia or China. Most of these countries in China and Southeast Asia, they had a period of what I call a big push in private investment highlighted in the circle. They had an extended phase of high private investment, and then it started to slow down. That's fine. But that big push never came in Bangladesh. It was very kind of gradual, the red line, gradual and slowly increasing, and now it's stagnant, the private sector investment. We talked about very low FDI orientation. I'm not really getting into there because we know that we have been talking about this the last 2 days. Also, we know that our tax collection is one of the very poor in the world, and which shows that our domestic revenue mobilization, or the state, what we call in political economy literature, weak state capacity, because the state is not able to collect revenue to run its own machineries. So that's kind of very important. That doesn't really help us much. We have talked about fragile financial sector. You heard about this in our earlier session too, about this non-performing loan and poor business environment. And there is a growing concern about external debt burden. I think the story, what we heard in the past, that the debt GDP ratio is kind of tolerable, that story is gone. Because we need to rethink this debt issue, considering our foreign exchange reserve, considering our export capacity, and from various perspectives. And it shows that debt burden is growing huge. And you also heard that example or story, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, when he's mentioning that probably you have borrowed $100, but we actually spent $30. So the $70 went out due to corruption. So how do you really, pay back? Probably you are considering that $100 debt, but the actual job was done only $30. So I think these are serious issues. Structure of trade, I would not really get into that much details, but high concentrated export basket, very vulnerable. And also when it comes to the kind of product Bangladesh produces, it's called economic complexity. Many of you know it, and I know that the students of economics, they are also aware of this economics complexity index, where you see that the kind of products Bangladesh produces is not really complex. It's a very simple type product. And compared to many countries, and that really makes your case very vulnerable. Social sector, we heard yesterday, remember, Dr. Imran Motin, he was talking, and he was showing that comes out from our white paper study, that if one person in Bangladesh, we are talking about the poor people, he or she doesn't work for 2 days in a month, that person is so vulnerable to fall into poverty. Probably he or she is non-poor, but he or she doesn't get a salary of 2 days, you fall into poverty. So that means that vulnerability is very high. And then we also have serious problems in health and education. You heard about in the last session also. So I think in my last two slides, one is this institutional failure. And that is extremely important when it came out in the last regime where corruption, erosion of democratic institution, crony capitalism, and captured by a segment of business elite, that really became rampant. So against these things, against these irregularities, the kind of initiative or reform which are needed, which we have been highlighted in both in the White Paper Committee and the Task Force report. So I think we had a very interesting discussion in the last session. But then my question to the distinguished panelist chair also about this geopolitical challenge. My question is there any robust foreign policy of Bangladesh? When you're talking about foreign policy, does it really, do we have any proper foreign policy? Do we have serious, I know that probably from audience we can have some questions on, I'm not really getting into the nitty-gritty. How do you really balance the relationship between India and China? We have serious Rohingya crisis and border security issues. We also know that the energy security and climate diplomacy is very, very, very important. And then what our Honorable Chair, he mentioned about this geopolitical influence on the development financing, that is also coming up very strongly. And challenges in multilateral diplomacy. I think we have serious weakness there too. So how do you really, this is my last slide, how do you really build economic resilience for Bangladesh? I see 5 critical areas to consider. We need to have broad-based economic growth, rethink about our structural transformation and the way economic policies have been designed. We need to have proper macroeconomic management, strengthen the social sector, strengthening the institution, and finally, of course, pragmatic and proactive foreign policy. With this, I would like to end my presentation, and I invite a chair, our guest of honor, and all the panelists to come over dais. And also, we'd like to hear from 4 panelists. Yes, please.
Okay, distinguished panelists, please take your seats. It's my honor. Okay, shall we cut to the chase then, very quickly? We have four distinguished panelists. Dr. Famida Khatun, Lailufur Yasmin, Fahim Mashroor is here? Yeah, of course, yeah. And Professor Pervez Karim Abbasi. 8 minutes each, and to be kicked off by who? Famida Khatun? Will you start, please? Yeah, Famida. Okay, so you need a gap. So, Lalufar then.
I can go first. I can go first. I can go first. The youngest will go first.
Okay, Abbasi will go first. Otherwise, I will give a ruling in this regard.
With the chair.
I usually rule, but in these academic ambience, I'm far more.
One of the legacies of the CSP.
Never mind the. I'm glad you acknowledge the legacy. Thank you. Go on.
Sir, yeah. I have your permission.
Yeah.
Shall I go there, or we can? Oh, no, that's much better. Thank you, Professor Rayan, Salim Rayan, and again, thank you, the more decent namesake of former American President Clinton of Australia. Again, a dear friend of mine. And I know that, again, we'll be testing your patience because this is the last session of the last day of a very interesting conference. Again, thank you to Sanem and to Dr. Salim Rahan for calling us over here. And thank you for allowing me to address this first. So I've been told that I have 8 minutes, but hopefully I will try to finish within 7. 1 minute, again, I've already wasted. The issue at hand over here, because the last session should be a bit more lively. When we talk about resilience, and it starts with an R word, but that calls for also reflection, that calls for rumination, that calls for retrospection, that calls for reform. And I agree with Dr. Salim Rahan, not because he's the organizing host, but there's a very accurate assessment of today's problems. And as an economist who specializes in geopolitics and geoeconomics, I will dwell on the economic issues for 2 to 3 minutes, and then I'll dwell on the geoeconomic aspect. So that is the structure. Now, let me just give you some aspects of why the resilience of Bangladesh's economy is being sorely tested. And that has been discussed also. One, inflation is persistently stubborn, refuses to come down from double digits, especially so in food inflation. And we know that most revolutions, most political discontents, even the much touted French Revolution took place because of economic malmanagement, of rising inflation, and because of limited finances. So this is one of the reasons why Sheikh Hasina's kleptocratic regime collapsed, was because of the state of finances or lack of thereof. And also, yes, it almost creaked like that when the government collapsed. But again, apart from this, so inflation, as you know, is having a disproportionate impact on the vulnerable income groups. And if that is not addressed, nothing will be. And the current government's, I'm sorry to say, monetary policy, while orthodox, again, it focuses on raising the interest rate, but that only curtails foreign investment, that only curtails more so domestic investment, and private sector credit growth is down to 7.5%, much lower than the 9.8% target set by the interim government, which in itself shows that, again, just raising interest rate to impact inflation is not working, because it's a supply chain issue, it's a supply disruption issue. And again, what is applicable in the West is not usually applicable in emerging or developing countries like Bangladesh. Moving over, Bangladesh's resilience rests on 2 R's. One is remittance, and one is RMG. You don't need to be a rocket scientist for this. And that takes place in spite of any government. And we almost rack in $70 billion without breaking a sweat. But, and even this year, in the first half of the fiscal year, your remittance growth and your export growth have been on the uptick. Import growths have slightly picked up, but that is because of the Ramzan effect and importing food. But apart from this, all other indices, if you talk about, again, foreign direct investment, that has fallen. If you talk about job creation, that has fallen. If you talk about, again, your private investment, stagnant at 24%. And we are at a perennial middle income trap. And now we come to the geoeconomic and geopolitical aspects, because economic issues, we have far more capable economists over here. The one aspect that really, really worries me is the low tax base. Even now, 65% of registered taxpayers did not file in their tax returns. And we are tied to stringent reforms conditions by IMF where we are supposed to raise our tax base. That means incapability and, again, unwillingness to ruffle feathers. Because, again, if you have to expand the tax net, it has to be inclusive. Only the white-collar salaried people cannot be impacted. And that's why you see government relying more and more on indirect taxes. Apart from this, if you look into the other issues, and this is the part where it gets tricky, over $104 billion in loan. And our debt servicing has increased by 27% in the last 6 months of the current fiscal. Now, that also, who owns debt gives you authority. Right now, Bangladesh qualifies as the 7th most indebted nation to China. Do you know who's the first? Pakistan. our erstwhile brethren. And multilateral institutions like World Bank, ADB, and AIIB increasingly and also increasingly have larger say in Bangladesh's macro policy management. That will also translate into geopolitical influence. Apart from this, and that was a question that was raised by Professor Selim Rahan, do we have a foreign policy? In all reality, friendship to all, malice to none, it's a very good non-aligned maxim for Cold War times. But in this age, with Trump coming in, and he's putting the gauntlet relentlessly, our days of ducking in the sand like an ostrich and pretending that we are small and friendship to all and equiproximity won't cut any ice. That's the bottom line. Either there are two alternative systems developing. US-led Western system, which is schizophrenic, and also at times alternating with who owns the White House. Either it is more inclusive or it is more protectionist or more neo-mercantilist. And we have a Chinese-led alternative system, so we also have to think which way we need to go. It's not for us to decide, but we need to have broad-based political consensus. Number two, will we, won't we? Indo-Pacific strategy. We have something called an outlook, which is at best a pastiche, because it was quickly assembled for a visit of the former Prime Minister to Japan, where we adhere our commitment to free, open Indo-Pacific strategy, but then we say we will adhere friendship to all and animosity to none. What happens if China decides to exercise its claim in the East China Sea in 2026, 2027, reunification of Taiwan? What is Bangladesh's foreign policy stance? One way or the other, we have to spell it out. And depending on the regime, either we are pro-India or anti-India. That is childishness. We need to decide our national interests. And our national interests must be lacking emotion. It must have pragmatism. There are no permanent friends, no permanent allies. What about BRI? It was good for infrastructural project investment, but what if US-led Western pressure comes, whereby they're saying that Chinese investment is one way of securitizing, again, threat to the Western order? What is our response? RCEP, we are all for every program. We never say no. We want to get into every club. The perennial party crasher, get crasher at parties. RCEP, the negotiation hasn't started. The standards have not been investigated. And again, our FTA push with Singapore and others are languishing. What about comprehensive economic partnership agreement that we were starting, but under secrecy with India? We could not even recuse ourselves from our onerous obligations with the Adani Group, because in the international court, we will lose the case until and unless we force another renegotiation. What about regional import from Nepal and Bhutan, which they are interested in? But you need India as a buffer state. And Japan's Big B project is predicated on closer economic and political integration with India's northeast and Bangladesh. Whereas in China, China is also interested in the centrality and unitary union of Myanmar. Without China, you cannot have a Rohingya crisis resolved. We have Arakan State, a non-state actor on our borders. What are we doing about this? And again, when I wrap up, we often tend to emphasize the individual over the country. First it was, again, Sheikh Hasina, now it's Dr. Yunus. All due respect, Dr. Yunus has done a stellar job. But 174 million people of Bangladesh, their destiny must come before individual adulation. And again, I have no answers. We're not supposed to come up with answers. Our job is to just jog your interest so that you, the future generation, you, the audience, come up with ways and means where we can have a healthy interactive environment where we discuss means and ways of reaffirming our tryst with destiny and thus be truly resilient. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Tryst with destiny, of course. No, thank you, Abbas. I didn't expect anything less from you. some of the points that you raised, we will respond as we wrap up. I have, over the last few weeks, read some of the reports that have come out on the situation. Tacitus once said, Felix qui patuit rerum cognoscere causas. Happy is the man who knows the causes of things. But these reports actually have to describe more the effects, what has happened, but not why this has happened, and not also, as Lenin famously asked, what is to be done. So we were weak on those two aspects. But you are perfect on some of the points that you made, particularly in an area of my interest, to which maybe towards the end I will respond. Next on my list is Lalifar. No, sorry. Fahim Mashroor. Fahim Mashroor, and co-founder, of course, you.
Thanks. After erudite speaker, I might sound quite boring, actually. So, like, I will just come directly to the kind of presentation that Selim Bhai actually gave on the resilience part, actually. So, let me play a little bit devil's advocate on that thing, because otherwise it may be much more kind of monotonous. So I think, like you mentioned about the informality of the economy as a weakness. I completely agree on that on a very much longer perspective, but can we think about that aspect? Say, for example, during the COVID 2020, all the economy in the world, all the Asian economy and other economy actually had at least 2 subsequent quarters of negative growth. Only exception was Bangladesh. We had a kind of negative growth in only 1 quarter. Then actually economy rebounded. Before a lot of other economies in the world, even compared to India or even Indonesia, Vietnam, and other parts of the world, even in our continent. So actually, I asked that, how did it, of course, the earlier government took a lot of credit to that, but we all know that it is much more a political rhetoric than anything else. Because I think we actually possess that inherent capability of resilience just because probably of the informality of the economy. So informality may have actually been a kind of a blessing in disguise for our economy. Because, for example, like we all know that our banking sector is quite like disconnected from the significant part of the informal economy. 90% of our enterprises, there was a kind of economic census probably a couple of months ago, I guess, the economic census, it mentioned that we have got over 10 million economic units. And more than 90% of those economic units were not at all connected with the formal banking sector. So we all know that our major problem, and after 5th August, one of the major surgery, quote unquote, surgery is actually happening in the banking sector, and it is supposed to kind of create a lot of pain. So, but did it actually happen, the rural entrepreneur or the small retailers at the roadside? Probably not, because they were not, in the first place, they were not even connected with the banking sector. Our capital market is not connected with the real economy. So, lot of those things, I'm not saying that those are good things, but incidentally, those have actually been one of the reasons why our economy is normally kind of don't respond to some of the external shocks or even the internal shocks like political thing and other things like some other economies do. And COVID is an example of that. Even post-August revolution, all the data says that, of course, we had some in September and October, we really had some issues, particularly in August and September, had some issues in kind of disturbance and disruption of even factory and a lot of other things. Even like throughout October, November, a lot of garments industry were actually having a lot of those problems. But all the data shows that from December or even from November, economy is actually rebounding. Our export is up in last calendar year. I think it is more than 10%. Our remittance is up because it is, by definition, remittance is always disconnected from domestic thing. So even import is actually going up because import was much more a function of our reserve issue. So of course our reserve issue has actually got a little bit better. So I would say that this whole thing about the informality of our economy has been a kind of blessing in disguise. Now, of course, we can't actually afford to have that kind of thing for a long term, and I personally think that this kind of window of reform that we are talking about, we should actually utilize this window of reform, whether it is for next 6 months or next 1 year, to do lot of things that normally a political government would probably hesitate to do, particularly for example, the banking sector reform and a lot of other sector reform. Those are really essential for a long-term economic quality of our country. So a lot of things we have actually put under the carpet for decades. These kinds of, for example, NPL, the non-performing loan. Now it is actually being said that almost 40% of the banking assets are actually bad. So we have to kind of come out and say that, okay, let's kind of clean those things. So, and it will have some impact, no doubt, and we have to be prepared for that. We have actually gone through a massive, massive revolution. And if we expect that our economy will be performing, our business will be performing as usual, I don't think that is a kind of fair expectation. So I think even like a business community sometimes actually become too kind of restless that, okay, well, like we are, of course we are suffering. A lot of kind of jobs are being lost and a lot of those things. Of course, our inflation is a major issue, but I think, in that particular context, I actually think that the central bank has been doing a pretty decent job in kind of having a contractionary monetary policy, and most of important is their role is to kind of clean up the mess for last 2 decades. So for that, there will be some hard pain in the economy. But on the inflation thing, I think inflation is, and I think a lot of other speakers have mentioned, it is at the end of the day supply side problem. And I would actually extend it further. It is much more a governance problem, because all of us know that the major inflation is basically imported from outside, in a sense that our oil is being imported, 95% edible oil is imported, sugar is imported, wheat is imported. So unless we actually solve the major issues in kind of corporatization or concentration of supply chain, we really can't actually solve this inflation problem. So I think I would actually urge the policymakers to take this window of opportunity of reform to actually really address those supply side issues. And also another thing, I think in some of the industries, we have actually overinvested because we kept artificially low, the interest artificially low at 9% for kind of more than 1 decade. Lot of investment should not have been done in Bangladesh. Say, for example, we are a energy scarce country. When we see that lot of the entrepreneurs actually got bank loan for industries like ceramic or glass or even steel, those actually have huge amount of energy consumption. So we need to kind of ask ourselves that did we actually, or should we have actually invested on those sectors that didn't create a lot of employment? We actually should always invest in those sectors which has got high level of employment component into that. So I think these are some of the things that we need to, the hard questions we need to ask. And I actually take it as a kind of course correction, as like opportunity, then really kind of like stabilizing the economy. So I will actually stop here. So maybe we can discuss later.
Thank you so much. Very good. At the end of it all, I mean, your broad thesis would be everything comes back to governance, or the lack of it, isn't it? I mean, you're giving all the sectoral problems, but eventually, I mean, you have to govern well. And another thing is reforms is not dealing from governance, because reforms is a continuous process. And as you govern, as a government governs, government reforms. And sometimes I political does not mean that you belong to a particular, you have to belong to a particular political party. If you govern, you are in politics. So I just wanted to make that point not often recognized. So now, of course, I will recognize Eliphar, and I'm not sure as to what you'd speak to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like I'm in a soup amidst all the economists. Sir and I come from foreign policy background, and with a very hard question posed by Selim Bhai, later on emphasized by my good friend Parvez. Does Bangladesh have a foreign policy? I initially thought that I'll be talking about what are the sort of economic resilience related issues and what are the global challenges and global economic and in the global economic and political landscape. Instead, I have to redirect my talk on attempting to answer some of the questions. And I must have to also acknowledge Selim Bhai continuing this, Sanem program, and the last day he wants to see the intersection between economy and politics. And this is a perfect way to sort of end a very important 3-day program, because although Clinton's namesake, President Bill Clinton said economy is stupid, but in fact it is a political decision. At the end of the day, whatever decision a government is taking in the name of national interest, in the name of its interest in being re-elected, it turns out to be political decision. As Sir very rightly pointed out, it is a political government, whether you belong to a political government, a political party or not. So we often forget, and that is why we have seen, especially post-COVID period, what we have seen is Japan having an economic security ministry. Australia itself has an economic security department. What does it mean? It means that economic assets needs to be protected with a political mindset and political decision. We have to be able to see what are the issues that are coming up in the case of protecting our supply chain, in the case of protecting our businesses, in the case of protecting our interests. So not only that, it also talks about what kind of global order we are living in. There are a couple of articles written, and Parvez also mentioned about it, that we seem to be seeing an emergence of two opposing, sort of blocks, America-led bloc and China-led bloc. But we often also forget that China has equal interest in the survival of the global economic system, global capitalist economic system. Look at the map of Latin America. About 90 to 95% of the country's biggest trading partner is China. Look at in South Asia. And now I'll blend this sort of part with whether Bangladesh has a foreign policy or not, because that answer is very important. Although I must have to confess, I do not have the answer. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Probably would be writing policies or something. And very few. Okay, so something. But the issue is that what kind of international order, what kind of global order are we looking at? We know that at its minimum, we want sovereign integrity to be respected by all the parties concerned, by all the state actors concerned. And from there on, we can see Bangladesh's foreign policy. I have long been talking about this, that friendship towards all, allies toward none, it has its own explanation. It's not only that I have to be friends to all and I cannot be enemy to all. We are forgetting that when it came to Bangladesh's interest, Bangladesh was capable enough to say no to a couple of, several instances, and it started since, 2021 onwards, when it came to, taking up stranded Rohingyas in the Bay of Bengal. Bangladesh received a call from UK Foreign Minister. Bangladesh was requested to take the boat people. Bangladesh simply said, no, we are not going to take them in Bangladesh's land. So Bangladesh it's not like Bangladesh hasn't said no. And there were other resolutions at the UNGA about Myanmar, and Bangladesh was not happy about it. Bangladesh abstained, and it was later rewritten with Bangladesh's permanent representative's assistant, and then Bangladesh voted in favor of it. So the thing is that what Bangladesh followed altogether, what I would call both active neutrality and passive neutrality. So in today's age, non-alignment is not only about not being aligned, but also how we are being not aligned or how we are being aligned. That is, I mean, Bangladesh, a country like Bangladesh, will be engaging actively where its interest will be served. So for Bangladesh, equally at the global level, America, to some extent Russia, China, and Australia, European Union, UK, they are significant actors because that is where most of Bangladesh's trade goes. But at the same time, when it comes to different issues, Bangladesh maintains, and you can find evidence. I have only 8 minutes, not 80 minutes, so I'll be short. So there are, areas. It's difficult for teachers. So in the case of issues, Bangladesh maintains passive neutrality. So what does passive neutrality means? Is that Bangladesh refrains from amra gobhir bhabe porjobekhon korchi, refrains from making any comments, and we rather like to take a step back and observe where it is going. This is an equally strategic position that Bangladesh takes. Often we make fun of it. Okay, Bangladesh is observing, but sometimes you need to take a pause, take a step back, and reevaluate what your position would be. Not like a eager beaver, you have to jump at every occasion and make a comment. So that is passive neutrality. It does not mean that Bangladesh is disengaging completely, but Bangladesh is waiting for its turn. Then again, we have to, this is the last phase, we have to look at Bangladesh's position. I have written about it, and I hope someday it will get published. I've written with Selim Bhai that Bangladesh is surrounded by India. This is both its weakness, both its strong suit. So in this, sort of encircled situation with a narrow escape towards Myanmar, and then with in the South Bay of Bengal, Bangladesh has but little choice to take either pro-American, anti-American, or pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese position. This is a sort of a pragmatic sort of step Bangladesh has to think, and that is why I believe Bangladesh, for friendship towards all, malice towards none, is not just a statement, but there are various facets of it that we need to seriously think and decide. And last but not the least is the Rohingya crisis. We need a durable, sustainable solution to it, where we need to, as I've written a few weeks back, that we need to learn to engage with non-state actors. We need to learn to talk with Arakan army. We have to sort of find out what are Bangladesh's strengths, opportunities, the SWOT analysis, threats in these sort of cases and weaknesses. So Bangladesh has to take a pragmatic approach in engaging both with Tatmadaw, the present Janta, and as well as what can we do in the ground level with the Arakan army. And they have also expressed their willingness to engage with Bangladesh. They are already, they have engaged with some of the regional powers like China and India. So why Bangladesh will be lagging behind? So we need to seriously think about our options, because on the side of the Arakan, just the way Arakan army provided guarantee of securing assets of China and India, Bangladesh will have another access as well. Bangladesh cannot, just because we have a concave nature of the Bay of Bengal, we need to remember that all the time. So a lot of things left unsaid, but I cannot but thank Selim Bhai for including a IR person. Apparently we just talk and do nothing much on the serious areas, but my 2 cents. Thank you.
So last but not least, of course, Dr. Fahmida Khatun, we are all waiting to learn from you.
Thank you, Chair. It's 7:30, so I should not be speaking at all. So, it's quite challenging after all these learned people have spoken and covered all the areas. And what I wanted to say, I do not have much to speak, but much of the points I would dwell on probably in a short period of time would be repetitive. But it only means that these are very important points. Salim started his presentation with this argument that whether Bangladesh is resilient, and he does not tend to agree with that, Bangladesh. In fact, we have lived on this concept of resilience for a long time, and we have also tried to take credits at the national and international level of, by projecting our resilience. But in fact, if you look at the macro level, Bangladesh's economy is not resilient, what we are now observing. This is a testimony to that. I can elaborate later on. But if you look at the micro level, it is in fact resilient in the sense that, for example, Bangladesh is a country which is vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And who are the most vulnerable of the impact of climate change? It is the poor and marginalized people. And of course, over the years, Bangladesh has improved upon protecting the people who are vulnerable, who are affected. But at the same time, it is the people who have learned to cope with this situation. Hundreds and hundreds of years of natural disasters, natural calamities. These are the people first. They save themselves and they save their relatives and friends and family first. And then later on, the government support goes. And in fact, now Bangladesh takes credit at the world, at the world level, at the global level, of being one of the countries which can take care of the natural disasters so well. This is because we have indigenous knowledge, and which has been learned from the people who have been dealing with these natural disasters every year. So from that point of view, yes, our people are very resilient. But in case of the macro level, macroeconomic scenario is now vulnerable. Two speakers, both Fahim and Salim mentioned about the data, unreliability of data. And because of that, we had a false understanding on the economic strength, which is not the case. And in fact, when you have a vulnerable economy, that is visible, or that is understood when there are crises. For example, during COVID, we have seen that how, because of lack of governance in various sectors, particularly the health sector, how the weaknesses have been visible. Stark reality, as we all knew, but then during COVID, it was more and more visible. And worldwide, we have seen that those economies which had a weaker fundamentals, stood up on a weak base, those were the ones who faced more challenges. But those who had a robust economy, robust health sector, they could face those challenges much better. And now also, after the COVID, Bangladesh economy, like many others, started to bounce back in its own way. But then the Ukraine war comes. And that had globally increased prices, so across the world, and including the developed countries, developing countries, every country was struggling with the high inflation. But the difference between Bangladesh and the rest of the world is that we have an inertia, policy inertia. We do not recognize the problem, or even if we recognize, we do not want to take the right policy at the right time. So for a prolonged period, during the last almost 3 years, we are struggling with high inflationary pressure, but most of the countries have now tackled their inflation. Why? Because they had taken the right policy at the right time, and that was the right monetary policy, including not only the developed countries, but also developing countries, our neighboring South Asian countries. They also had followed a contractionary monetary policy, which is the basic arsenal any central bank would have in its store. So, but we had another, not economic reasons, but we were relying or we were looking at the interest of a section which was dictating the policies. So in the past, much of this you mentioned about the governance. At the end of the day, it is the issue of governance. But, and also the governance across economic sectors that have been weakened because of the interaction between money and power. How? Because we have seen that over the years how politicians have become businessmen and businessmen became politicians. So the nexus has really, dictated the terms, economic policies. And that is why the central bank, Bangladesh's central bank earlier, during the earlier regime, could not take a contraction in monetary policy because it was serving the interest of the rich and powerful and politically connected people. And that's why, it maintained a rate which is much lower than the existing inflation rate, which was suicidal, you can say. Of course, in the case of Bangladesh, monetary policy is not the only tool which can address the high inflationary pressure. We also have to have a coherent fiscal policy, a trade policy, and most importantly, the market management and monitoring and governance, whatever you can say. So that is also another issue, another story, that how our policies do not work. So that's why the resilience of the economy itself, became vulnerable and weak. And when resilience is jeopardized when there are vulnerabilities. And our vulnerabilities are both domestic and external. Domestically, as the presenter Selim and other speakers also have mentioned, that the weak institutions, lack of reforms, these are structural weaknesses, and we have inherited these structural weaknesses for decades, in fact, and no policymaker, no government had really addressed that challenge. That is the fundamental challenge, that weak, weak structure or the structural problems, and for that you need reform, you need institutional strengthening. The other issue is, of course, the diversity of the economy, investment on the economy for diversification and removal of those bottlenecks. For example, for investment in the human, in case of human resource development. And a biased investment was observed during the previous government, that physical infrastructure was the target of investment because it has also various sorts of benefits, in the sense that not unwritten benefits, you can say, that higher the projects, higher the mega projects, higher the investment, higher the kickbacks. So all the focus was on physical infrastructure. And by doing so, we have neglected human resources, investment on human resources. So that is another weakness or vulnerability of the economy, which is also a component of the, of the country to be resilient, if we really want to be resilient. And related to that, I would also touch upon the, one aspect, which is, of course, Fahim's area, that is our negligence on technological investment in technology, investment in STEM, because the future is technology, and technological disruption is imminent and is, every day, every other day, we hear about what is coming on. All these tech giants are talking about how technology is going to shape or change our lifestyles and our economy. So are we ready to cope with that? Absolutely no, because if you look at the investment itself, in the national budget, education and technical areas, that receives one of the lowest allocation. Health is another. These are all related to human resource development. So I think, I would end with saying that we really, and another issue, I mean, technology is of course, the other, this is also external, both external and internal, that is the impact of climate change. This is going to also disrupt our existence itself. And for that, though Bangladesh is not a big emitter, only less than 1%, about 0.4 or 0.5% of total global carbon emission is done by Bangladesh, but it is a victim. We are the recipient end. So we have to address that. Apart from adaptation, a huge investment is also needed for mitigation side, that is on renewable energy, and also access to affordable energy, affordable clean energy. That area, so there we need to also demand our fair share from the global platforms, from the people, from the countries which are the most polluting world. Of course, that brings us to the geopolitical issue, that geopolitically also we are facing challenges, talking about climate issues, how the larger countries, larger emitting countries are withdrawing. I mean, talking about the US, much has been discussed about US politics and all US policies, but here also this, in the case of climate, this is a really worrying issue. The other aspect is Bangladesh's, in the near future, is that Bangladesh's graduation, which has been touched upon by yourself and also by Selim. So our preparation, we are not really quite prepared. So that is another issue. So these are the areas where our resilience are going to be really facing a lot of challenges. And you mentioned about that we do not, your duty is not to recommend, but I think our duty is also to recommend. And we have a lot of recommendations, and tomorrow and day after we will present, I'm just tomorrow and day after we'll present a lot of recommendations on various sections of the economy. So with this, I would like to thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I like the way you present all your arguments with very cool reason. I have watched you from Singapore and I've watched you from here, and you do it very well, without passion, but with arguments. I want to make one or two. Shall I wrap up now, or is that? Well, okay. We'll take a question. Just before we take a question, I just want to make point about technology and development, etc., which we keep hearing. It's a philosophical point that I will make. You see, humanity has two sides. You see, you have your mental human side. You have human emotions such as love, hate. These have gone on for centuries in the same way, whether it's Shakespeare or Agamemnon or whatever. You see, you have loved, you've hated, you've fought, you've conquered, you've stolen, you have punished. You've done all that. On the other hand, technology is something that is happening very rapidly, very rapidly. I mean, you have split the atom now, when you are now thinking of even post-kinetic development. So the great challenge of civilization will be how to match and calibrate the development and changes in technology with human emotions, which are sometimes constant, and technology, which is always forever changing. So, okay, we'll open this to questions now, and of course, we'll begin with you. You'll have to identify yourself, by the way, for record.
This is Professor.
Professor, indeed, and that need not have been said. But
just 1 minute. And student of economics, and I am proud of. I'm a freedom fighter. I'm energized for all of the discussions. Very valuable. But I have a small question to Mr. Abbasi. Why do our foreign policy is still a mismatch and unable to go forward march in keeping our heads up, অর্থাৎ মেরুদণ্ড সোজা করে দাঁড়িয়ে? আর কারণটা হচ্ছে যে আমি একটু বাংলায় বলি, আমরা আর কত বড় হব দাদা ঠাকুর, আমরা আর কত বড় হব দাদা ঠাকুর, সুনীল গঙ্গোপাধ্যায়ের কথা। 53 বছর কেটে গেলেও কেউ কথা রাখেনি। সুতরাং আপনি যদি এর উপর একটু কমেন্ট করেন। থ্যাংক ইউ।
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. I'm Mohammad Asim Hossain, a student of economics at the University of Dhaka. I would like to shed some light on a particular prejudice that Bangladesh's status as a relatively small economy with limited global influence, does it offer any inherent advantages in terms of economic resilience compared to larger economies? And the second question is about a topic that has been talked quite a lot about, which is our LDC graduation. So how does our LDC graduation will impact our economic resilience? I would like the panel to elaborate a bit more about it. Thank you.
Acha. Last one. Yeah, okay. It is last.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum, good evening. My name is Omar, and I'd like to congratulate Dr. Raihan for making an excellent presentation and for the two distinguished diplomats to make their statements. I just want to pick on one or 2 points. Dr. Raihan mentioned foreign policy, which is important, but I think within the foreign policy, what we really need is a foreign aid policy, because what is happening now is we're borrowing millions and billions of dollars. We're depending on, like, the joint secretary and the foreign minister will go to the World Bank and negotiate, or the secretary of ERD will go somewhere and negotiate ADB, Philippines, millions of dollars. Or somebody will go to China and negotiate suppliers credit, or Russia suppliers credit. And that's what's putting us in this debt trap, huge debt trap. So what we need is to streamline foreign aid policy. And secondly, once we have a parliament, the parliament should have oversight over every loan agreement that the government undertakes. That's one point. Number two is we talked about tax GDP ratio. I think there's but nobody's counting the shadow taxes that everybody's paying here. And I hope you understand what I mean by shadow taxes, because we are always paying bribes and this and that, which is a huge percentage of how much we spend. Now, why would anyone want to pay taxes? Because you need some benefits, like in Australia, Canada, USA, taxpayers get some benefit. Here, taxpayers, all the money is either stolen or is spent on a huge inflated government. And if you see the earlier today, we saw the social safety net. 70% of it is going to the government officials as pensions. So it's essentially government of the government, by the government, for the government, where people don't matter. And the World Bank and the IMF, they have a one-size-fits-all policy, raise taxes, and to have with subsidies. And it's kind of amusing that these guys don't pay a single penny in taxes for their lifetime. And they're suggesting going all around the world saying raise taxes. So it's kind of interesting.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Actually, I had to close because it has been recommended. Just go around, respond to the questions very briefly, then I'll wrap up because we are running out.
I believe I have one question specifically addressed to you. And again, all right. Again, there's a paucity of time because there'll be revolt in this hall if we continue for longer than 5 minutes. I'll take a minute. Bangladesh foreign policy is almost like, and I'll just say a story short in 30 seconds, about a girl that was interested in the university. She was friendly to all, never said no. So unfortunately, everyone was friendly towards her. Nobody thought about her long-term prospect. Now, jokes aside, I'll just give you 2 instances. Number one, most of our foreign policy energy, at least in the last 15 or 17 years, I'm not saying everything in the past regime was bad. Again, that is also a very knee-jerk reaction. But most of the time, our energy of our foreign policy mandarins who are posted abroad are to do the biddings of the political masters or the rulers over here. Whether it's the Bangabandhu centenary, again, where everything else was dropped, including the Rohingya issue, and again, we pursued this abroad. And you'll talk, and every person in the Ministry of the Foreign MOFA is going to tell you this, at least in private. And second, even the Rohingya issue, though on a humanitarian basis, I support it personally. But as a statesman or as a diplomat, many people still say that again the former Prime Minister wanted to compete with Dr. Yunus in terms of getting a Nobel Prize and has got us into a predicament from which we cannot get out of. Just ask the people where the refugee camps are there. It's a ticking time bomb. And our aid commitment is going down. So I know that foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics, but we do not have sound economic diplomacy, we do not have sound military diplomacy, and I'm sorry to say we do not have even sound climate diplomacy. And the government pays lip service to this, and it doesn't even engage the think tanks, like CPD, for example, perpetual enemy of any political government or any government in place. We do not make use of our think tanks. No, that doesn't mean I'll be invited to CPD seminars as speakers. I'm just saying the truth. Again, that's my 2 cents of answer, and let me hand over the mic.
Is there anybody else? Yeah, very good. Anybody else who would like to react to any of the questions? If not, just a few points in conclusion. Thank you for this enormously stimulating discussion. There are more questions asked than answered, of course, but as the Greeks used to say, that to know what to ask is to know half the answer. I want to respond to one question not one question, the idea, the concept of foreign policy, which has been much discussed. Now, you see, unfortunately for teachers and professors of your kind and students like you, things have been made very easy during the Cold War era, the post-war era order, because there is a United Nations which has 193 members, and you all think that you're all equal because everybody is an equal member of the United Nations. And therefore, your idea of sovereignty is that all states are equal. And this is a myth that we keep hearing over and over again. All states are not equal. Your sovereignty is not the same as the sovereignty of France. Your sovereignty is not and the sovereignty of Lithuania is not the same as the sovereignty of Bhutan, for instance. Today, as the United States withdraws more and more back into what we call Fortress America in order to make itself great again within quotes, what will happen is there'll be de-emphasis on multilateral institutions. As a result, it will be God for us all. Today, let me warn you that a time will come, and a time will come very soon, when sovereignty will be differentiated. You'll have different levels of sovereignty. You will have to behave with many countries in different ways than you deal with other countries. So forget about equality. You will be like how the 500 states of Europe related to one another in the European context. Thirdly, you see, when you say making a foreign policy, you assume that some people sit over there, government or cabal. Cabal, by the way, is like Christopher Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley, and Lauderdale in the British Parliament. Yes, and then you make a policy. No, it's not like that. It is usually elements within your community, powerful elements, will compete with one another for the ear of the big person. This is what the American analysts have called bureaucratic politics. People like Morton Halperin or Wallace, bureaucratic politics. CIA has its own politics. Department of Agriculture has its own interests. Department of Commerce has its own interest. In our country, the defense has its own interest. ERD has its own interest. So all these institutions will compete with one another for the ear of the principal person in government. So all this, at the end, the output, by definition, will not be rational. For example, I've heard it being said about India, I think, India foreign policy. Now, what's India to you? India is many things to many people. India is, say, there is an India beyond the Vindhyas, beyond the Lakshman Rekha. We have a different policy with India beyond the Lakshman Rekha. You will probably have a different policy with the Bimaru states. Bimaru is not sick, but Bihar, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, etc. You will have a different policy with West Bengal. Some say, and I've heard it critiqued, and quite rightly, that perhaps Calcutta was more independent of Delhi than Dhaka was. You see, it is an irony, but it is a sad truth. But that is the reality. What I foresee in about 5 to 6 years, a kind of relationship between governing institutions, which will be very different from what we have seen in the past 15. So it will be each for us all and God for all. They used to say that the only permanent thing about foreign policy or foreign relations or global politics is there shall always be an England, and England shall be free. But even that is not assured. Thank you.